And good afternoon. Welcome to the start of the WorldOregon webinar on our Great Decisions series. Today is Russia and the US. We're joined by Professor Sarah Henderson from Oregon State University, a great partner of WorldOregon. I'll be saying a few more words about Professor Henderson and giving her the floor for this fascinating talk. But first, just a few general remarks. As most of you know from joining our webinars in the past, WorldOregon webinars are designed for our members who help support us financially to make this possible then for the general public. And we welcome a large OSU contingent joining us today, a great partnership that we have. And note that those of you who are fans of hearing OSU professors speak, we got another one upcoming on February 24th in the evening with Christopher McKnight-Nichols, a perpetual popular presenter who is speaking on pandemic exhaustion, comparisons of the current time to that of about 100 years ago with the 1918 flu. So don't miss that out. We'll post in a minute the link where you can register on our website. That's a free event. We have the continuation of Great Decisions going on through into early March. Thanks for all of us who joined us yesterday for the discussion group in partnership with Portland State University students. And one last reminder about upcoming events. This Sunday, our young professionals have a long reads club, which is when they dive into a long form journalism article about international education, some of the challenges of that in the international marketplace, looking at an example in Canada. Again, a reminder that this webinar, the only people with a video and audio on are WorldOregon staff and our presenter. We will post links of interest in the chat. We ask that you pose questions for the professor in the Q&A function. That helps us to manage those questions better. Again, interest, comments, and links will go in the chat. Please post your questions in the Q&A. This presentation is being video recorded for posting on YouTube. If you've missed any of the previous Great Decisions events, please look at the YouTube playlist for Great Decisions. We'll post that in the chat as well. And now to today's program. Again, it's very timely talking about Russia and the US. I know many of you have been closely following what's going on with the situation in Ukraine and hoping for a peaceful outcome to this challenging situation. Professor Henderson is well versed in prepared for providing this discussion. She has a PhD from the University of Colorado, where she also got her master's. She has a bachelor's from Oberlin College. She comes highly recommended from her students and her colleagues, and we're thrilled to have her today. Without further ado, Professor Sarah Henderson, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. All right, it's good to see, I can't see everybody, but I can see participants ticking up on the bottom of the screen. So I want to thank all of you who've come to talk today about both understanding Putin's Russia, also Russia-US relations, but of course, all within the context of this unfolding crisis. So I don't have a ton of, I have a few slides that I wanted to share with you. Most of them have visuals, so we can look at maps and something to kind of look at rather than all sorts of text for you to read. So I'm going to take a second to share the screen here. So I'm going to share this. I'm going to wait for a minute and just make sure that goes through. And then I just want to make sure everyone have that. Are we good here? Can people see the slides?
Yes, we're good.
Okay, excellent. So when I was thinking about what to talk about today, first of all, I don't want to spend the whole time talking. One thing that I've noticed is I want to give all of you a chance, at least half the time, to kind of ask questions. My experiences with these kinds of forums are that you're all really well informed. So you don't necessarily need me to explain necessarily what happened or to go over the reading that we all did. But rather you're probably more interested in ways that we can interpret what's happening. And what a critical time to be talking about Russia, US relations and Putin's Russia in general, given this ongoing crisis. Whether we want to see it as a crisis about Ukraine in terms of which way is it going to look? Is it going to look eastwards towards Russia or westwards towards the larger Western European structure? Whether we want to understand this as Russian frustration over NATO expansion and the larger European security structure. And so just here, if you look at this slide, what you'll see is it's not broken down into different eras, but here we can see kind of pre-NATO expansion eastward before 1997, and then all of the orange countries are since 1997. They didn't all join at once. So the map is kind of conflating a couple of different eras of expansion, but you can see how since 1997, NATO has pushed eastwards. And so you can sort of see that Ukraine kind of sandwiched there, literally between geographic east and west. And so thinking about how I can be helpful to you today, right? I don't have a crystal ball. I bet we all wish we did, that we could all understand what's happening. I don't have any insider connections to the administration I can pump for information. But I imagine, like many of you, the tensions between East and West over Ukraine are scary, right? Somewhat nerve-wracking. I think in part because if you look at this map on the left here, this is just a map of what the West thinks they know about military buildup. You can see that Russia has started building up troop and other military presence around Ukraine. This started last year, and then at the end of the year, when military intelligence was made public about this, President Putin and his administration issued the infamous demands that were really fourfold. One, written guarantee that Ukraine and Georgia not join NATO. Two, that there are no security operations that go on within post-Soviet republics. Three, that to some extent, military operations and presence go back to pre-1997 expansion. And four, that US remove nuclear presence in Europe, which is seen as a security threat. And what makes this conflict so difficult is that most analysts on the outside agree that there's really neither side is going to get what it wants, that there's no possible way for Russia to get its demands met. But at the same time, there's also a sense that given the decline of democracy and internal divisions in the West, they don't necessarily have the same abilities nor political will to project a united front in terms of trying to decide how to respond to this crisis. And so if we just kind of look at the pictures that I have here on the slide, I just have one of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which the US withdrawal, which many people see as a sign of that Putin took of declining US influence in the globe. And also what the other pictures show, even though you may not be able to read them very well, is a larger global context. If you look at the map of the US, that's an image that indicates that analysts who measure the quantity and quality of civil rights and civil liberties in the US have noted a marked decline in that over the past 5 to 10 years. And also, if you look at that small picture in the left-hand corner of these kind of all of these bars, what that shows is that globally, worldwide, since 2005, every year, the same organization, Freedom House, that measures the quantity and quality of democracy around the world, have noted more democratic reversals than improvements, and that this has been a global trend that has been gradually accelerating since 2005. So the terrifying thing about the Russia-Ukraine and European security crisis is that it also comes at a time in which statistically political scientists have measured, it's not all in our imagination, not just a decline in the quality and quantity of democracy in some of these newer countries that have democratized since the collapse of communism, but also in areas of the world that were once considered stable and impenetrable to democratic reversals. So to think about Ukraine, here, let me see if my slide is going to switch. Come on. There we go. When I was thinking about what to talk about, I read the piece by Professor Lynch on Putins Russia. And I think it makes several important points that can serve as a jumping off point for understanding what's going on over Ukraine and European security more broadly. And at first, when I read it, both because it was very informative, but also because Tim recommended that conversations are more lively, that you can take issue with something in the reading. And when I first read the article, I thought, it seems like a pretty good overview of Putin's Russia, the sources of its domestic legitimacy. Here, if you just look at the visual of the slide, that's not just his analysis. This is just one image of enduring public opinion data about approval ratings for Vladimir Putin. So you'll just see it's kind of snippets from every single year since he came to power as prime minister. And there are a couple of things to just take away from that slide. One is that some people worry that public opinion polls are completely manufactured. So if you look at the bottom, you'll see it's done by a place called the Levada Center. So that's probably the most well-known public opinion polling agency within Russia that also works with many Western agencies. So there is just kind of a visual of the ups and downs of his public approval. So that was kind of one of his main points, that there are very real reasons for public approval for Putin. A lot of that is correlated with Russia's strong economic performance. That's what the next visual shows. You can see the rise in Russia's gross domestic product. That's just simply the size and value of its economy. And particularly in those first two terms in Putin's office, you can see not only how the economy exploded. I don't have slides to demonstrate this, but that economic growth also trickled down to the Russian population in terms of more reliable and better pay, longer standards of living, and improved living conditions. And I think the other contribution of the article is it also talked about the very difficulty for an opposition to make a response to the Putin regime. And not all of that is due to the levels of state repression, but it also has something to do with the fact that the opposition has a difficult time getting traction with a large segment of the population, given the improvement in people's lives. The other big point that I think the article made was talking about the deterioration, or in many sense, the collapse of US-Russia relations across administrations. And so he took us through all of the different administrations, and in some ways, every single president has attempted a reset with the Russian government. But in pretty much every single presidency, US national interests have led presidents to pursue agendas which have been completely counter to Russian national interests. And so Professor Lynch sort of, at the end, all is not well in Putin's Russia. In fact, he sort of made this tantalizing comparison with Brezhnev's Russia. So here we have a picture of Putin dressed up as Brezhnev, indicating that in some ways, just like in Brezhnev's Russia, this was at a time in which Soviet influence was at an all-time high, but at the same time, this masked very deep and real economic problems, a general period of stagnation, a rise in corruption, And standard of living problems, which they're not obvious at the time, came to occupy much of the Gorbachev administration, and then was much of the impetus for his failed attempts at reform. I mean, so those were what I took as kind of the main points of the article. And at first I was like, well, what could I take that I would have issue with? And I think in some ways, what is most valuable about the article is in many of the ways in which it precisely doesn't try to mystify the Putin regime. And what the article contributes to, which I think is sometimes lacking in the analysis about Russia and Russian politics, is kind of a comparative perspective and the treatment of Putin not as either a supervillain, an evil genius, or perhaps a dying bear, but rather kind of places him among other personalist autocrats like Turkey's Erdogan, like Hungary's leader, and looks at them as regimes that have to deal with very real trade-offs in terms of maintaining power. And so if you just look at this map on here, what the map shows is, again, a map of countries around the world divided by democracies. Those are countries in green. The yellow countries are called kind of hybrid regimes. Those are countries, right, in which you might have elections, but they may not necessarily be free or fair. And then purple countries, which are known as authoritarian countries, are not free. And so this is a map from that same organization, Freedom House, that I talked about earlier. And so in general, what this map shows is that not only has there been a rise in the number of regimes in the past 2 decades that are purple, but it's also led to a greater academic interest and understanding about, well, how do authoritarian regimes work? And so the research now that's being done is taking a deeper look at authoritarian regimes and saying, yes, authoritarian regimes restrict political freedoms, but they nonetheless rest on components of legitimacy. They need to earn some kind of political and public approval, but they also have to balance this with very real interests from the small elite that usually keeps them in power. And so when I read the article, it also made me think about also trying to understand the Ukraine crisis. And I don't know what all of you think, but one thing that's been so difficult, I think, in terms of trying to deconstruct what's happening in Ukraine is because it involves Russia and Putin. So much of what's going on is engaging in the sort of mystical art of Kremlinology, you know, trying to figure out what lies beneath relatively cryptic statements or maneuverings within the Kremlin. And so if you just look at these pictures, I think this is actually interesting. This was a picture taken by the photographer Platon, and that picture appeared on Time magazine, right there on the left, when Putin got Person of the Year, maybe it was 2007 or something. And what's so interesting is this image has been used by forces of opposition, by critics of Putin, by supporters of Putin, right, to kind of project whatever image that they want to tell or story about Putin onto this kind of this face. And so if you'll actually look, this actually picture is illegal in Russia right now, but it's been appropriated by the gay pride community. You'll also see kind of the use of that same image. Putler is Hitler, Putler is Stalin. On the bottom, that's been appropriated by the Navalny campaign as kind of, you know, Putin is corrupt overlord. And so the larger thing that I think makes it difficult to understand what's going on in Ukraine is that there tend to be kind of two big dominant narratives about Putin. And I think what Lynch is trying to do is provide a little bit more of a sophisticated one. So this is just a slide I stole. I'm teaching Russian politics right now. Every day when I teach class, my students bring a new meme to class because one of the things we've been talking about Russian politics is sort of the image both that people want to project onto Putin, as well as the image that the Kremlin also cultivates around Putin himself. But first, let's kind of talk about these two competing dominant narratives that are told about Putin, and then to see how they're playing out in the Ukraine crisis right now. So I think, one dominant narrative that we see a lot in the media, and when I say these narratives, right, there are of course elements of truth in all of them, but also I want to talk about how, in what ways these narratives aren't helpful. I think we've all sort of seen variations of Putin as kind of the super villain, evil genius, a kind of a third variant as James Bond villain character all rolled into one. And I think in this portrayal of Putin, it's a pastiche, right, that connects very real elements, Putin's KGB past, connecting his KGB past with a long-term plan to silence dissent at home and abroad through Putin's sanctioned selective assassinations, as you can see with the picture of the dying KGB agents in a bed in London. Putin's comments labeling the collapse of the USSR and this kind of portrayal of Putin as a geopolitical disaster for Russia is taken as a signifier that Putin wants to reassemble the old contours of the USSR. And this narrative, then, Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, rather than potentially being maybe kind of an ad hoc, spur of the moment, take advantage of an opportunity, is rather seen as part of a larger master plan, not just to reassemble the borders of the old USSR, but to overthrow the entire kind of European and world democratic order through sowing chaos in European and US elections. In this view, Putin will not stop until he achieves a scary, revanchist, aggressive, and expansionist reincarnation of the USSR. And in this view, in general, particularly with the Ukraine crisis, the foreign policy recommendations that follow from that view is that tough sanctions are the only way to deal with a leader bent on global domination. Any kind of negotiation with this type of ruler is tacit approval, appeasement of the vilest kind, and the specter of Western-inspired military confrontation is the only possible solution. Troop movements to the surrounding areas by Russia around Ukraine are not a bluff, but indicate an actual intent to invade. And not only is the integrity of Ukraine at stake, but the entire post-World War II global order as we know it. And in response, only a united Western European response, once they get over some internal divisions, natural gas dependency, can save Ukraine and by extension, world peace. I think a smaller variant of this portrayal in the news is sort of Putin, not just as the super villain, but also kind of evil genius. This sort of treats Putin like almost like a James Bond or maybe even a James Bond villain. And this approach seems to interpret him and his regime as relatively invulnerable. Russia is, thanks to its large hard currency reserves, invulnerable to influence, particularly since the invasion of Crimea in 2014. Russia has shifted towards building greater economic relations with China, does less trade with Europe, certainly much less with the United States. The fact that it is the largest natural gas supplier to most European countries gives it a 21st century weapon to get what it wants. Putin, in this view, is a mastermind. Combined together, whether it's Darth Putler or Putin as James Bond, the pictures of a supervillain that is both omnipresent, omniscient, and threatening. We're engaged in a life and death Cold War 2.0. And in the words of former Speaker Paul Ryan, Russia is a global menace led by a man who is menacing. And I think to some extent, right, when I read a lot of the media, I sort of see both this betrayal and then the policy implications that flow from that. I think on the other side, there's the perspective that sees President Putin not as a super villain, but perhaps as super overrated. Russia in this narrative is really a dying bear, literally. The Russian population is shrinking, perhaps tailed, flatlined somewhat, but thanks to high rates of alcoholism and homicide, in addition to its declining birth rate, right? Russia is on the way out. Soon, the high percentage of pensioners, if you look here at the bottom, that's a picture of, even though the Western media likes to post pictures of Navalny protests, the largest protests for the most part against the Putin administration have been organized by pensioners upset about the rise in the retirement age. But largely this view is that the high rate of pensioners will overtax Russia's dwindling economic resources. For those left, living standards will stagnate at least until 2035. Putin's popularity, that's only because he controls all the levers that shape public opinion. And in fact, in this view, his KGB record indicates, in which he was at a minor post in Dresden, really serve as an indication that he's a mediocrity. And it's kind of a wonder that he somehow manages to assert control at all. All that keeps him there in power is the economic goodies that he's handed out to allies from Petersburg, who now control the levers of power. In this view, the Russian state isn't really powerful at the domestic or the international level. And former President Barack Obama expressed this view towards the end of his administration when he gave an interview to The Atlantic, noting that Russia was, at best, a regional power, a weaker country that doesn't produce anything worth buying except oil, gas, and arms. Echoing that, as Senator John McCain famously stated, it's a gas station masquerading as a state. The policy implication of this view of Russia is marginalization. And this is much of what was the approach of the George W. Bush administration, but also after the failure of the reset attempt when President Obama and Medvedev were president briefly, was also to some extent the Obama approach. And the extension of this interpretation in terms of understanding Ukraine goes in several different directions. You know, one is that Russian security concerns are just ludicrous. President Putin has been told multiple times that NATO is no threat. It's almost exasperated. What's his problem? We've told him we're not a threat. Why is he still so upset about this? He's just being paranoid. Also, in this view, Russia can easily be punished by sanctions, because if you remove the sources of support to its cronies, you'll remove sources of support for Putin. Alternatively, used to several decades of being the more powerful players in European security, Russia will respond to the usual tools of deterrence. Even though it does have a large military, at the end of the day, it will just back down. Place some military troops on the border, get some weapons in Ukraine, but we don't really need to substantially respond to Russia. We just need to keep upping the ante. Sometimes these two views get kind of mushed together, right? In the sense that Putin is seen as somehow a bumbling, inadequate leader, yet he's able to complicate or conduct sophisticated cyber attacks. Other times he's seen as popular, but at the same time, he also has to cheat increasingly with elections. So none of these caricatures, even though I feel like they tend to dominate the news, helps us come to grips with the Ukraine crisis. And I think the changing reality of the 21st century global world order. Oh, whoops, I don't need to go to that one yet. Oh, I just bumped us out of there. Sorry, folks. I'm gonna go back to this first one for a second because I think that's fine. I don't have any new ones for what I'm gonna talk about next. So sorry, I got a new contact prescription 2 days ago and it's too strong, so I can't see anything close up. Anyway, so I think both these two big interpretations don't really help us understand the Ukraine crisis and the changing realities of the 21st century global world order. As most of you have probably gathered, what makes countries powerful is shifting in terms of the resources that countries have and need to get what they want. And countries' positions in the global arena are shifting. Russia's position in the global world order, its interests and the resources it has to pursue its interests, and the changing reality of Europe, which is much more fragmented in terms of what Europe means and how it should be governed. All of this impacts the ability for each side to get what it wants in Ukraine. So what would a more nuanced Lynchian type analysis indicate about sorting through Ukraine? And so these are just kind of the final remarks I want to make, and then open it up to questions and discussion. If, as Lynch tells us, Russia's political system is much more complicated than simply one person calling all of the shots, or one in which Putin's regime has a fair amount of legitimacy, one in which, even though election results are somewhat fabricated, they are not also completely made out of whole cloth. What does that tell us? And what that tells us is that the Putin regime actually is constantly faced with very difficult policy trade-offs. The typical kind of guns and butter policy trade-offs. On the one hand, its legitimacy with the population rests on providing the kind of economic benefits that it was able to bring about in the first two terms of its administration. And I'm going to go back to this slide. So one challenge, on the other hand, the power group that Putin has, to which he sort of owes his continued presence in office, which is the security services, right, might want different things. But let's first look at what Russians want. One thing that we know is that even though, if you look at Putin's public opinion ratings here, at this slide, you can see there's a big boost in 2014, right? That is the boost that Putin gets for the reintegration of Crimea, or the—
Sarah, this is Derek. If you don't mind trying to share your screen again, we're not seeing your slide.
Oh, we're not seeing it? Oh, okay. No. All right, thanks. All right, hang on. Give me a second, everybody. Let's see if I can find the share screen. There we go. We got
Great.
that?
Yep,
Okay.
we can see it's on the supervillain slide. There we go.
Okay, yeah, so now, I just did it again. My students always tease me about when I start getting kind of, slightly like, what's happening? I can't get this to pull up. Everything falls apart even more quickly. Okay, so first let's look at the first. This is the big bounce in public opinion as a result of the annexation of Crimea. One thing, I couldn't find a good slide that would take us through to right now, this common era of, or 2022 right now, so I apologize, but if I could pull it up, what that public opinion data would show that, at least domestically, there's not a lot of appetite for going into kind of further foreign policy machinations with Ukraine. And part of that has to do with looking at this other slide, the economic growth slide, which is that Russia hasn't really been able to achieve the same level of economic growth continuously year after year as it was during those first 8 years from kind of about 2000 to 2008. Part of that has to do with global oil prices have just not been as stable. The other part of that has been that as Putin has stayed in power for longer, he's been more likely to use his power of appointment to hand out economic goodies to elites that help keep him in power. And the result of that has been stalled economic growth. So a Lynchian analysis that we read would tell us to perhaps be a little bit wary of the sort of Putler analysis of what's going on in Ukraine by pointing that there are real kind of domestic, at least not impediments, at least cause for concern that would act on a brake for the Putin decision-making process. The second point that I would make that maybe Lynch makes us think about is his points about the deterioration of the US-Russia relations, that it was based out of Russia's belief that its core interests cannot be achieved through collaboration with the US. And this belief is built at least in part off of experience of Russia's experience of not having their interests validated or incorporated into the global structure. And I think what Lynch would say about the Ukraine crisis is that, like it or not, Russia and Russians do see NATO as a threat. And like it or not, there's an asymmetry in terms of what Russia and the West is willing to do in order to get what Russia wants. Do I think Russia wants to invade Ukraine? No, but I think is Russia willing to invade Ukraine to get its points across? I do think that yes, it is willing, even if not wanting to do so. The second key point that I would take, going off of Lynch's points about foreign policy, is that while the West sees Putin as rash, the message that many Russians get is that he is the cool head of reason and pragmatism. It's the West that's rash and hysterical. This is a message that he's been consistent on since 2007. So in some ways, perhaps what the West doesn't realize is that he's the foreign policy moderate at home, domestically, particularly in comparison with the communists and the Liberal Democratic Party, the other two major parties in the Duma, that are pushing for a much harsher take on Russian foreign policy. So I think a more nuanced portrayal of the regime would argue that the Russian elite understand perfectly well, right, that their demands are over the top, that they're not going to be met, but that any kind of compromise for the Russian regime is actually going to be a win. Because no matter what, right, after 22 years, President Putin now has the West listening to him and listening to Russian demands. The last observation I would make, and then I want to open up to questions that I think make the situation dangerous. And one is that each side, I think, thinks it has the long-term advantage over the other in the region, and thus there is little incentive to compromise. Part of this, I think, Russia's dangerous miscalculation, I think, is part of being a personalist authoritarian regime. As Putin has become more isolated, I think he is more likely to surround himself with people who tell him things that he wants to hear. On the West side, I think this is based with a very difficult self-examination of power in the 21st century, and coming to terms with the fact that the unipolar era of the post-Cold War era, and even the era of kind of Western dominance, is waning, not only in part to rising powers like Russia and China, but also because of internal divisions within the West itself. And so I think as a political scientist, what makes this time so frightening is the lack of acknowledgement that power has shifted to some sense globally. The West has less resources to get what it wants. It has the same hard power resources. And rising powers like Russia have more power tools to get what they want, and they're willing to use it. And so I'll stop right there because I want to make sure that there's room for questions. Okay.
Great.
All right. I'm going to turn off my slides. Can I do that so I can see? I can kind of see people once again. Does that work? Can I get?
Sure.
Should I get rid of these?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. This is Tim DeRoche, Director of Programs. I'm going to jump in, and we're getting some good questions from the audience. I'm going to start with one. I'm going to actually frame this as a two-part question, because you sort of hinted a little bit at this about NATO expansion at the end. The question is Putin actually worried about NATO expansion, or is this just a scam on the Russian people to distract them from real problems at home? And the second part of this is, how does the sphere of influence that Putin seems to crave compare or differ from the days of the Soviet bloc and the Cold War?
Right. Well, let me take that. I mean, there are a lot of questions about kind of why NATO, why now? And I haven't heard a lot of good explanations for that. I think one thing that I've heard that sounds somewhat reasonable is, as most of you know who follow Russian politics, you know, his second time around doing 2 terms at the 2 terms in the presidency will end in 2024, and so they're sort of raise this issue now, kind of in plenty of time before the election, to potentially get some sort of bounce from it. On the other hand, what we have seen is there hasn't really been a huge bounce in public approval for Putin as a result of most of this. That most Russians still want to focus on kind of bread and butter issues. So I don't think it's really a kind of rally around, if it was meant to perhaps inspire more support, I don't think that's happening. And I do think the Putin regime is not in trouble in terms of public support. It's kind of, you know, it's gradually declining, but he's been in power for 22 years now. So I don't think it's manufactured. I do think Russian aspirations have always been to be seen as a great power. What has changed is their capabilities to achieve their aspirations. So I think maybe that's what's different. So that's one question. The second question, wait, what was the other question? I should have taken notes.
Oh, the second question was about the sphere of influence that Putin seems to crave. How is this different from the era of the Soviet bloc and the sort of the maybe a lust for empire?
Right. You know, I'm not sure. I mean, so one thing that, again, I'm actually operating off the belief that the Russian elite is not stupid. And I only say that because you know, there's some people like, I can't believe Putin issued these demands. You know, surely he knew that he wasn't going to get any of that. And I think they do know. And along that vein, I think Russia knew in 2014 that by annexing Crimea, that it was going to lose Ukraine. And in fact, I didn't show the last slide that I had. I guess I can screen share again. And that was that sort of, you know, the unintended consequence, or maybe they knew this was going to happen, of 2014 Crimea, is that Russia did lose Ukraine. And what I have are kind of 2 election slides here. One is of a pre-Crimea presidential election where you can sort of see it's evenly split between kind of a pro-Russia and a pro-Western candidate. If we look at Ukraine's 2019 presidential elections, you can see the country almost goes entirely for Zelensky. So there's just, you know, this kind of little, the Donbass region, which is still pro-Russia. So I think what Russia wants is they probably want Ukraine to be kind of like Kazakhstan, which is not necessarily that Kazakhstan sits in Russia's back pocket, but it's not a problem for Russia. So I would say that's more what Russia wants, rather than necessarily kind of reassemble the same kind of sphere of influence that it used to have. So I could be totally wrong, but I just don't see like installing a puppet regime in Ukraine. When I read those articles, that seems a little bit to me more like the kind of Putler logic of Russian politics. And I think economically and politically, that's just not a goal. It's more I think Ukraine is caught up in it, but I think it's truly a frustration about lack of Russian influence in sort of European security more broadly framed.
So you mentioned economically and politically. What are the costs to Russia to engage in an invasion or an elevated conflict with Ukraine?
So one thing, and I'm going to go back to that map. Let's see. Sorry, I have two screens here and I keep clicking on the wrong one. So most of you know, if we look at this map of NATO's expansion, you might have read in the news already that absorbing Crimea itself was tremendously expensive. It's huge. Also continuing to support the separatists and the population in this area here with the shading on the map of Ukraine on the left. Because if you're Russian, you can have a Russian passport. That's simply extremely costly, given if we again go to this economic model here. This is the size of the economy rather than growth rates, but right now the Russian economy is projected to grow at about 2-point-something%, and the global average is 4-point-something%. So Russia's not keeping up with the global average. And so absorbing Ukraine or any part of Ukraine economically is just going to drag on that further.
Sure. Sarah, just to interrupt you,
Yeah.
you weren't sharing the map again.
Again? Okay, here we go. Here's the map. So I was just pointing out, if we go back to the Ukraine map, you know, just this bit of Crimea here, you know, Ukraine is the largest country in Europe. So just absorbing Crimea was incredibly costly, as well as providing support to the shaded area here on the Ukraine map to the left. And then if we look at Russia's economic growth, the sanctions already that were put in place in 2014 in Crimea, it wasn't enough to change Russian behavior, but it certainly incurred a cost, a kind of significant cost. So even though the economy starts to grow again, the main complaint is that it would have grown faster. Now, the other cost, of course, would be if the Biden administration can pull together a sanctions package, which it threatens to do. But I'm a little bit less confident in the Biden's administration to pull that off, just because, as most of you have read, the types of sanctions which would impact the banking sector would hit back not just on the US economy, but on the Western European economy as well. And so it could be that those sanctions are being threatened as a brinkmanship, but I actually don't think anybody wants to implement.
So from the economic and political side, let's shift over to the Ukraine side. What's the economic damage to Ukraine now, and how would that increase in the event of a Russian invasion? And how do they weigh the risks and the benefits of either an appeasement or resistance? And I'm curious how this is impacting their decision making.
Okay, let's see. So I don't have any figures off the top of my head about kind of the cost to the Ukrainian economy. I think it is quite costly. I think probably some of you have also seen some of these articles, and the reason why I'm pulling up this map is that the Ukraine crisis. So one thing that's interesting is, you know, since 2004, there's not been a Ukrainian president that's been able to serve more than one term. And this gets to Ukraine's larger economic problems, that per capita, it's a much poorer country than Russia. So there's not really a huge incentive to Russia to want to economically absorb even poorer country because of its problems with corruption and presidential bids that when they come to office, they're going to clean it up, and then they can't. means that politically, Ukraine just kind of goes from, presidency to presidency. And so what's happening right now in Ukraine is it's kind of emboldened the current president's political foes. So if you look at this map here of the 2019 elections, so Zelensky, the current president, are all the green areas, but Petro Poroshenko has been kind of, he's the brown area. He's sort of been re-agitating and critiquing the Ukrainian government. And so I think those are the types of things that probably Russia wants to see, is Ukraine off balance, not particularly economically successful. I don't think it ever thinks it can bring Ukraine back into the pro-Russia fold, but if it can kind of keep, I think, Ukraine off balance, I think that would meet Putin-defined Russian foreign policy goals. Because I think the Russian narrative of Ukraine is, and this is the Russian narrative, is that it's kind of a poor, kind of incompetent, country that can't quite manage itself. I think that's probably the Russian elite Putin perspective on Ukrainian politics.
So in terms of things being off balance, that leads me to a question about the US. How much of Putin's posturing and timing is a response to perceived cracks or weaknesses in the US's influence in the world? And I'm thinking relative to the Afghanistan withdrawal, stumbling blocks in the transatlantic alliance, and continued domestic partisan turmoil.
Oh, I think, absolutely related. So, I think in terms of Putin trying to achieve his national interest, he's just reading the scene correctly, which is that, if you're going to make a move, now would be the time to do it. It's unclear whether Biden's going to, it looks like midterm elections are going to be nasty. This is probably the closest he's going to get maybe to a one-term presidency. If we look at this, I don't know if I've successfully screen shared again, this map here, this visual, and what it indicates is just when the United States, when there used to be surveys done about the quality and quantity of civil rights and civil liberties, it scored a 94, back, I would say, still during the Obama administration era. And since then, we've slid to 83 points. And I think that plays right into Putin's hands, and it certainly domestically makes his points that, who is the West to be lecturing me when they have so many internal problems. I think it makes him sound very, very reasonable to a captive audience, and also to other kind of rising autocrats around the world. So I guess maybe in that sense, I hope the international community is taking this seriously. Sometimes I feel there's a kind of an attempt to dismiss Putin as kind of a thug, or, just this kind of autocrat that can't do much damage. But I think he's been a pioneer of something that is now referred to as sharp power, which is kind of the power to perforate other kind of societies or countries, often through pointing out or exacerbating their own internal divisions. And I think, that's a new tool that's getting increasingly used.
Well, and that's a different strategy in the diplomatic playbook. So it makes me wonder, are we beyond diplomacy with regard to US-Russia relations at this point? And is there a way to walk back the saber rattling and the finger pointing around regional and global security, cyber hooliganism, misinformation campaigns? I mean, there's been so much of this. What's the way we come back to the table with any sense of trust or hope?
Right. Well, I think, and I'm sure all of y'all who've been reading this have been reading, some scholars, I want to say Steven Sestanovich, who used to work for, I can't remember which administration, but some kind of advocate, don't forget about off-ramps in terms of diplomacy. And by, kind of off-ramps, meaning trying to find ways where they're outs. So I've read a couple of suggested off-ramps. one is focusing on, things that the West doesn't really want anyway. And so one point is that NATO doesn't actually want Ukraine or Georgia as a member. They can't remove that membership offer, but that it's not really politically, economically, or geopolitically feasible. And so one suggestion has been just a moratorium, because that wouldn't actually really change existing reality, but it would be a concession. There are other concessions about, create a new security structure, which would somehow offer a place for discussion. I think, a third has been maybe focus on, sort of other arms reductions. And I think that's entirely possible if you subscribe to the perspective that Russia doesn't actually think it's going to get what it said it wanted, that this is kind of a long game to try to get different concessions. Unfortunately, in some ways, diplomacy, it's carried out in the public, but it's also the least public of all kinds of interactions, because so much of it is about posturing, to try to get what you want. I think one thing that's been hard for me is it's clear what Russia wants, but it's not clear to me what the West wants. And I think that makes it hard. Is it that they just want the crisis to go away? Because that would indicate, right, maybe some kinds of concessions. Is it that they want to go back in time to the 20th century when Russia was still weak and not really able to create problems? That's not so feasible. So I think that's an actual big question that it's not quite as clear to me what the West wants. Well, I think it needs to decide.
So thinking of an off-ramp, I mean, what can the US, I'm talking to Sarah Henderson, pretending that you are guiding our policy there. What can the US, Europe, and NATO offer Putin that he could treat as a win?
Right. I think he could treat almost, I think some narratives are like anything would be a win, right? Because he's always said publicly, I'm not planning to invade. It's of course, like, why else would you? It's a little disingenuous. So I think either a moratorium on expansion, which would just codify what already exists. Another option would be some sort of agreement to not actually put any weapons on certain republics, and NATO would probably just negotiate on ones that aren't central to its security structure anyway. I actually think anything, just the very fact that all of these Western leaders are shuttling back and forth to Russia is a win for Putin. I think in some ways, right, Russia has already won if what it wants to do is demonstrate that what it thinks matters. It's won that thing. Now, the larger problem is that in the long term, Russians just continue to lose because the type of political system discourages the kind of economic innovation that they want to see for their lives to get better. But I think in the short term, Russia has already won some things.
Well, so does the current situation shed any light on any eventual succession plan or scenario for Putin? He's been in power for so long.
I know. Yeah, nobody knows what's going to happen. There's no clue. Right now, there doesn't seem to be anyone that's being groomed. So no one's been put before the public. I think the Prime Minister, Mishustin, is a formal kind of tax auditor. In some ways, was picked for maybe his inability to build a power base So I just don't see anything. Now, Putin himself is 69. So and the few times I see him on TV, he seems so incredibly bored and tired of what he's doing. I don't know what's keeping him going. But no, there's nothing, and that's probably how the Kremlin likes it. Is this idea of nothing's been decided.
So keep them guessing is the way to go, I guess.
I think so.
well-
I mean, from his perspective, yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. You know, it was funny. I was reading a different policy option. Somebody was suggesting that Ukraine declare neutrality, but I don't think that's going to happen. But that was floated out there in the IR community. But it probably would win significant, you know, economic concessions from both Russia and the West if it did that.
Well,
Domestically, it would be very popular, but.
so we're coming up on the end of our time. I want to thank you, Sarah, for some fantastic perspective. It's such a complex issue. Putin is so inscrutable. I think that's why we all get so fascinated. He does have the sort of Bond villain par excellence about him, which keeps us all guessing, as we were just saying. But I want to thank the audience for asking some really great questions. I want to bring Derek back on to take us out into the day, and thank everyone for being here. It's always a pleasure.
And always just send me an email if anybody has any questions.
Well, it's great to have you as part of our Great Decisions series, Professor Henderson. Fascinating discussion. I'm posting in the chat, again, the link to upcoming events where you can register for the remaining Great Decision events upcoming. And we'll post here in a sec a link to her bio page from her OSU website. Again, a reminder that on February 24th, we have fellow OSU professor Christopher McKnight-Nichols in the evening talking about pandemic exhaustion, very timely given everything that's going on with the in the US right now, and looking back at what went on in 1918. Again, I'm posting here in the chat the link to her OSU page, where you have lots more information about Professor and how to reach out and contact her. Thanks again for your wonderful presentation. Thank you, audience, for joining us. Wish everyone a healthy and safe and fun weekend.
Bye, everybody.